Good morning, everybody. It's August 5th, 2026, and after 5 months of Iran holding one of the most important waterways on the planet hostage, the grip is finally cracking. Iran just told the world it has reached an agreement with Oman on a proposed shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz, and that joint statement is sitting in final drafting stage right now. But here's the part that actually matters. This isn't Iran winning. This is Iran folding under a blockade that has been bleeding them $500 million a day, month after month, while their currency collapses in front of their own people. So today we're breaking down exactly how the United States Navy turned the most valuable choke point in the world from Iran's biggest weapon into Iran's biggest liability, why the Pentagon's blockade architecture made that possible, and why Tehran is suddenly desperate to sign anything that gets American warships off their doorstep. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this so-called Iranian victory is actually the exact opposite. Let's set the stage, because you need to understand how we even got here. This war did not start in August. It started back on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian military and government targets. And Iran responded by doing the one thing it thought would bring the entire global economy to its knees. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. For context, that's the waterway that roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas passes through every single day, squeezed through a channel that narrows to about 21 miles wide at its tightest point between Iran and Oman. Iran figured if they could hold that choke point hostage, the West would blink first. So the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps started broadcasting warnings over open radio channels, telling ships no passage was allowed. Then they backed it up. Sea mines got laid in the strait. Merchant vessels got boarded. Some got attacked outright. By the time the dust settled on just the opening weeks of this crisis, we're talking about more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, some abandoned outright, 2 ships captured, and over a dozen seafarers killed or missing. This was not posturing. This was Iran trying to weaponize global trade itself, and honestly, it's not even a new playbook. Back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. Navy ran an operation called Earnest Will, specifically to reflag and escort Kuwaiti tankers through these same waters after Iranian mines and gunboats started going after shipping. 40 years later, almost the exact same story is playing out, just with drones and cruise missiles instead of speedboats with rocket-propelled grenades. And for a while, Iran's strategy actually worked, at least on paper. Daily transits through the strait dropped from around 135 ships before the war to what analysts described as a literal handful. Oil markets reacted exactly the way Tehran wanted. In the first days of the conflict, Brent crude rocketed from the low 70s into the hundreds, at one point spiking above $140 a barrel, the highest level markets had seen since 2008. President Trump threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants if the strait wasn't reopened by a set deadline. And Iran responded by threatening to target American and Israeli infrastructure, even floating the idea that foreign entities holding U.S. treasuries could be considered legitimate targets. That's how unhinged the rhetoric got in those early weeks. Iran even set up something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority back in May, a bureaucratic arm out of Tehran that demanded ships register, fill out a so-called vessel information declaration, and pay a toll before getting permission to pass, in some cases over $1 million per ship. So think about the audacity here. Iran is sitting there trying to run a toll booth on international water, using the threat of sea mines as the enforcement mechanism. It's like a guy blocking the highway with his own car and then charging you for the privilege of driving around him. And for a minute, shipping companies actually played along, because what choice did they have? With insurers pricing in war risk premiums that made entire routes financially unworkable. But the United States wasn't just going to let that stand forever, and that's where things start getting interesting. On April 13th, following the collapse of talks in Islamabad, the U.S. Navy flipped the entire equation on its head. Instead of just trying to force the strait open for everybody, Washington started blockading Iran's own ports, block the ships going in, block the ships coming out, and let Tehran feel exactly what economic strangulation is like from the other direction. President Trump claimed the blockade was costing Iran $500 million a day. And while Iran obviously isn't going to confirm numbers like that publicly, you can see the effects everywhere else. The Iranian rial cratered to over 1.9 million to the dollar, an all-time low. The Tehran stock exchange kept bleeding, losing over 2% in a single trading session at one point, dropping to around 4.77 million on the index. Basic goods, like eggs, chicken, and cooking oil more than tripled in price for ordinary Iranians in under a year. This is what happens when you try to run a hostage negotiation against a country that controls the entire logistics chain your economy depends on. And it wasn't just Iran and the United States trading blows directly either. The blockade forced a chain reaction across the entire region. Gulf states hosting American bases suddenly found themselves squarely in Iran's crosshairs because the Revolutionary Guard's entire messaging strategy shifted toward warning neighboring countries that hosting U.S. forces made them legitimate targets too. That's a dangerous game for small Gulf nations sitting a few hundred miles from Iranian missile batteries, and it's part of why so many of them have been quietly pushing for any deal at all, that gets American warships and Iranian mines out of waters their own economies depend on just as much as anyone else's. There was a brief window in June where it looked like this whole thing might resolve peacefully. A memorandum of understanding got signed, the strait started reopening, and oil actually slid all the way back down to pre-war levels around $72 a barrel, with U.S. officials at the time saying flows through Hormuz were nearly back to normal and roughly 20 million barrels had exited the strait in a single day. But that ceasefire didn't hold. By mid-July, fighting had resumed, the blockade got reimposed, and Brent jumped straight back up toward $86 a barrel within days. That back and forth, ceasefire, reopening, collapse, reimposition, is honestly the most important pattern in this entire war. And we're going to come back to exactly why that pattern matters later in this video, so make sure you stick around for that. Iran's response to getting squeezed the second time was, predictably, escalation. In late July, Iran fired ballistic missiles at American forces in what Central Command called a surprise attack. Every single missile got intercepted. Not one hit. The American response came the very next night. A heavy wave of strikes against dozens of Revolutionary Guard targets along Iran's southern coast, command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capability hubs, the whole picture. The Treasury Department dropped fresh sanctions the same day. American and Saudi aircraft hit militia weapon sites in eastern Iraq in response to more than 30 Iranian-directed drone attacks within 72 hours. Jordan's own air defense network had to shoot down 5 Iranian missiles fired at the kingdom. Kuwait took drone strikes on government facilities and civilian vehicles, and even had a worker killed at a facility during one of those incidents. This is a regime lashing out in every direction because the one lever it thought it controlled, the strait, had just been taken away and replaced with a blockade aimed straight back at its own ports. It's also worth remembering how we got from that July collapse to this week's Oman breakthrough in the first place, because the diplomacy never actually stopped even while the missiles were flying. The Islamabad talks that fell apart back in April were supposed to be the mechanism that ended this whole thing peacefully, with Pakistan hosting delegations from both sides. When those talks collapsed, that's the exact moment Washington pivoted to the blockade strategy instead of continuing to negotiate from a position of relative parity. In other words, the United States tried diplomacy first, watched Iran use the resulting ceasefire window to rearm and reposition rather than genuinely de-escalate, and only then moved to economic strangulation as the next lever. That sequencing matters because it undercuts the narrative Iran wants to sell domestically, that this was always a fight it was winning until outside pressure forced a pause. The reality is closer to the opposite. Iran had its shot at a negotiated off-ramp in the spring, didn't take it seriously enough to hold up its end, and got the blockade as a direct consequence. So now you understand the pressure cooker. And that brings us to what's actually happening this week, because Tehran and Muscat have been running back-channel negotiations for months trying to find a way out that lets Iran save face. The framework that's reportedly taking shape has ships entering the Persian Gulf through what's described as an Iranian-controlled route, and exiting through an Oman-controlled route, with service fees attached for what they're calling security and environmental protection. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson called the talks forward-moving and said a deal could happen if, in his words, certain third parties don't obstruct the process. Translation, if the United States doesn't step in and blow this up. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed there's been progress but no finality yet, and he's been publicly clear for months that giving Iran any kind of sovereign control mechanism over Hormuz sets a dangerous precedent for choke points everywhere else on the planet. Qatar, meanwhile, is pushing its own angle, calling for freedom of navigation and regional consensus rather than a bilateral Iran-Oman side deal that cuts everybody else out of the room. And Qatar's emir has reportedly been on the phone directly with President Trump, trying to help bridge the gap. So even among the countries supposedly helping broker this thing, nobody fully trusts what Iran is trying to build. Meanwhile, you've still got Iranian military voices back home insisting they will not stand idly by and let the American blockade continue, with one senior advisor to the supreme leader going on state television to say Tehran won't allow shipments through Hormuz outside of Iran's own stipulated route. So you've got quiet diplomats in Muscat drafting a joint statement while hardliners in Tehran are on television the same week promising defiance. That tension alone should tell you how fragile this thing really is. Here's the part I really want you to sit with, though. Iran wants this deal to look like a win domestically. State media wants to tell 90 million Iranians that Tehran forced the Americans to back down and that the strait belongs to Iran again. But look at what they're actually negotiating for. They're not negotiating to keep the strait closed. They're negotiating for a temporary arrangement, something reportedly capped at around 3 months, just to get some kind of managed reopening that gets the blockade lifted. That's not the language of a country holding leverage. That's the language of a country trying to get out of a hole before winter hits and the economy completely seizes. Now let's actually get into the hardware, because this entire blockade only works because of one platform that almost never gets the spotlight compared to fighter jets and bombers, and that's the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. When Washington needed a way to squeeze Iranian ports without dragging thousands of ground troops into another Middle East war, this is the ship that made it possible. The DDG-51 class has been the backbone of the American surface fleet since the late 80s, and there's a reason the Navy just kept building more of them instead of replacing the design outright. These ships are built around the Aegis combat system, paired with the SPY series phased array radar. That radar can track dozens of threats simultaneously: missiles, aircraft, small boats, drones, all at once, and feed targeting data to the ship's weapons in seconds. Sitting underneath the deck is the Mark 41 vertical launching system, which can carry anywhere from 90 to nearly 100 missile cells depending on the configuration, everything from standard missiles for air and missile defense to Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles for long-range strikes. On top of that, you've got a 127mm Mark 45 naval gun for surface engagements, close-in weapon systems for last-ditch point defense against incoming missiles, electronic warfare equipment to jam enemy targeting radar, and an embarked MH-60 helicopter for anti-submarine work and boarding operations. And it's not just the weapon systems that make this platform so valuable here, it's the crew and the doctrine built around it. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer typically runs with a crew of around 300 sailors, and every single one of those sailors is trained around one core idea: layered defense. You've got long-range detection from the SPY radar, then standard missiles to intercept threats far out, then close-in weapon systems as the very last line if something actually gets through all of that. Against a conventional navy, that's overkill. Against Iran's actual playbook of small, fast attack boats swarming from multiple directions at once, combined with shore-launched anti-ship missiles and increasingly drones flying low and slow to avoid radar, that layered defense is exactly the toolkit you need. Iran has spent years building what analysts call an anti-access strategy, specifically designed around denying larger, slower-moving warships freedom of movement in the strait. The response from the Navy wasn't to avoid the strait. It was to build a doctrine using smaller, more numerous, more networked ships that could absorb that kind of swarm and keep functioning. This is the platform that got sent into the strait back in April when the U.S. began mine-clearing operations, with 2 destroyers transiting the waterway as the opening move of what would eventually become the blockade architecture. And when Washington briefly tried Project Freedom in May, an operation specifically designed to escort stranded neutral shipping out of the conflict zone, it was these same destroyers doing the heavy lifting, backed by more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and roughly 15,000 service members supporting the effort. During that operation, the USS Truxtun and USS Mason came under what officials described as a sustained barrage from Iranian small boats, missiles, and drones, while escorting vessels through the strait, and they came out the other side without losing a ship, backed by fighter cover and Apache helicopters flying overhead. 7 Iranian boats got sunk in that engagement alone. Think about that for a second. Iran threw everything it had: small craft swarms, missile fire, drone strikes, at a task force built around destroyers whose design lineage traces back to the Cold War, originally meant to hunt Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic, and it wasn't even close. Compare that engagement to what a carrier air wing would have had to do to achieve the same result, and you start to see why the Pentagon leaned so heavily on the destroyer force for this specific mission. Sending strike fighters after fast-moving small boats scattered across dozens of miles of coastline is expensive, fuel-intensive, and honestly, not even the ideal tool for the job. A destroyer sitting on station with radar coverage across the entire strait, backed by helicopters and drones for close-in identification, can maintain that presence for weeks at a time without ever returning to port. That's the unglamorous truth behind most of modern naval blockade doctrine. It's not one dramatic engagement that wins these standoffs. It's the boring, grinding, day-after-day presence that never lets the other side get comfortable. But here's what actually makes the blockade work long-term. And it's not really about winning individual engagements. It's about persistence. A carrier strike group is an incredible show of force, but you can't keep a supercarrier parked in a choke point indefinitely without massive logistical strain. Destroyers are cheaper to sustain, faster to reposition, and there are simply more of them available. That's the entire point of blockade doctrine. You don't need to win a war of annihilation against the Iranian Navy. You need consistent, repeatable presence that makes every single Iranian vessel trying to move oil in or out of port a target of opportunity. Central Command has reported intercepting somewhere around 85 vessels since the blockade went into effect, with only a small number managing to slip past, according to shipping insurers tracking the situation independently. 3 ships got seized outright. Iran retaliated by seizing 2 cargo vessels of its own, which honestly is such an Iran move. You get blockaded so hard your own ports are dying, and your response is to go grab a couple of container ships, like that's going to even the score. It's the geopolitical equivalent of getting your lunch money taken and then stealing somebody's pencil on the way out, just so you can tell your friends you won something. And that's really the dynamic that forced Iran to the table with Oman. Iran's actual leverage was always the choke point itself, the ability to make the world believe the strait could close at will. But America's leverage was simpler and honestly more brutal. Iran's ports are the wound that won't stop bleeding. Every single day the blockade holds, Iran loses money it does not have to spare, on top of sanctions, on top of a currency in free fall, on top of a war that's already been running for over 5 months. You can put out state television broadcasts claiming military triumph all day long, but you cannot put out a broadcast that fixes an exchange rate cratering past 1.9 million rial to the dollar. Numbers like that don't care about propaganda, and it isn't just the rial. Analysts tracking Iran's energy exports say the blockade has cut off well over 1 million barrels a day of crude that Iran would otherwise be selling, mostly to buyers in Asia, at exactly the moment its government needs that revenue to prop up a war economy and keep basic imports flowing to a population that's already furious about food prices. There's also a quieter economic story sitting underneath all of this that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's the insurance market. War risk premiums on tankers transiting anywhere near the strait spiked massively in the opening weeks of the conflict, to the point where some shipping firms simply pulled their vessels out entirely rather than pay the added cost or risk accrue. Every time this war has flared back up, from the March escalation to the July resumption of strikes, you can trace almost the exact same spike in premiums and the exact same drop in daily transits. That's the part civilians actually feel, because those costs get passed straight down the chain to fuel prices, to shipping costs on everyday goods, to the price of literally anything that gets moved by container ship anywhere in the world. So when people ask why gas prices at home keep jumping around for what feels like no reason, a huge part of the answer has been sitting in the Strait of Hormuz this entire year. All right, you made it to the global roundup section, my friend. So let's take a quick lap around the rest of the world, because Hormuz is definitely not the only chessboard active right now. Over in Ukraine, the fighting intensified again overnight into August 4th. Ukraine's security services say their drone operators conducted more than 100 strikes against strategic Russian targets in a single push, hitting defense industrial sites, air bases, air defense positions, command posts, and even naval assets. Ukrainian forces also struck the Syzran oil refinery deep inside Russia's Samara region, adding another energy facility to the growing list of refineries Kyiv has managed to reach despite Moscow supposedly controlling the skies over its own territory. Russia answered with over 100 long-range drones and at least 1 ballistic missile aimed at Ukrainian cities overnight, part of a pattern Kyiv says is deliberately targeting energy and water infrastructure ahead of the coming winter, trying to grind down civilian morale before the cold really sets in. A Ukrainian drone strike on a warehouse in Russia's Moscow region killed 5 people and injured 10 more, one of 3 separate warehouse strikes reported across Russian territory that same night. Both sides are now trading blows deep behind what used to be considered safe territory, which tells you just how much this war has evolved from trench lines into a long-range precision strike contest that looks a lot more like the drone campaign happening over the Persian Gulf than anybody would like to admit. And while all of that's happening in Eastern Europe, tensions in the Pacific haven't cooled off either. Beijing continues ramping up pressure around contested waters in the South China Sea, and the message coming out of Washington and its regional partners has been consistent for months now, that freedom of navigation isn't just a slogan for the Middle East, it applies everywhere, including waters China would very much like to treat as its own backyard. When you step back and look at the map as a whole, you've got active naval pressure campaigns running simultaneously in the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea, and the Western Pacific. That is not a coincidence. That is what it looks like when multiple regional powers test how thin American military bandwidth can actually stretch at the same time, watching Hormuz very closely to see whether blockade doctrine actually works before deciding how far they can push their own choke points in contested waters. You made it to the 40,000-foot strategic analysis section, my friends, so let's talk about the connection nobody is really making out loud. Everyone wants to frame this Oman deal as some kind of clean resolution, a tidy diplomatic bow on 5 months of war. It's not that. Look at the pattern, not the statement. Iran has run this exact playbook before. Back in April, there was a temporary ceasefire that was supposed to reopen the strait, and Iran immediately turned around and started charging tolls anyway, treating an international waterway like a private business. That ceasefire fell apart. The blockade got reimposed in July, and now here we are again with another negotiated framework that conveniently caps out around 3 months. 3 months is not peace. 3 months is a pause button that Iran can hit reset on the second it thinks the economic pain has eased enough to try leverage again. Go back and look at the oil chart across this entire war, and you'll see the exact same cycle playing out in the price of a barrel of crude every single time. Ceasefire gets announced. Brent slides back toward pre-war levels around $70. Talks collapse. Brent rips back up past 80, sometimes higher. That chart isn't just a market indicator anymore. It's basically a live polygraph test for how much anyone actually believes Iran is going to hold up its end of any given agreement. And that's exactly why Rubio has been so blunt in public about not wanting to hand Iran any kind of sovereign administrative control over the strait, even packaged as a joint arrangement with Oman. Because once you let one country establish the precedent that it can charge tolls and dictate terms over a choke point that the entire global economy depends on, you've basically written the playbook for every other regional power sitting near a strait, a canal, or a shipping lane anywhere on Earth. Ask yourself why Qatar is pushing so hard for a multilateral framework instead of just letting Iran and Oman settle this bilaterally. It's because everybody in that region understands that whoever writes the rules for Hormuz today writes the rules for the next crisis tomorrow. Whether that's the Bab el-Mandeb, the Malacca Strait, or anywhere else, a handful of miles of water happens to sit between a country and the entire global economy. There's another layer worth adding here too, because Iran isn't just negotiating against the United States Navy, it's negotiating against its own internal contradictions. You've got a foreign ministry trying to project reasonableness in Muscat, while the same week, a senior military advisor to the supreme leader is on state television promising Iran will not stand idly by. You've got the Revolutionary Guard's own parliament aligned voices talking about tolls and sovereignty over international water, while the actual negotiators are reportedly working on a framework that caps their control at 90 days. That's not one government speaking with one voice. That's a regime negotiating with itself in public. And any time you see that kind of split-screen messaging, it usually means the side doing it is under far more internal pressure than its official statements are letting on. Here's the piece that really ties it together, though. The timing of this deal lines up almost perfectly with the economic reporting coming out of Tehran. The rial hitting record lows, the stock exchange bleeding value, food prices tripling for ordinary families. That's not background noise. That's the actual mechanism forcing Iran's hand. This war was never going to be decided purely by missile exchanges, or by whose jets could outfly whose air defenses. It's being decided in currency markets and shipping insurance premiums just as much as it's being decided over the water. The blockade did not need to sink the entire Iranian navy to work. It just needed to make every single day of closure more expensive than every single day of compliance. And once that math flips, regimes fold, no matter how loud the state television broadcasts get. It's the same reason those destroyers we talked about earlier matter so much more than any single missile strike. A single strike makes headlines for a day. A blockade that holds for 5 straight months rewrites a country's entire economic trajectory. And that is exactly the kind of pressure that gets a foreign ministry spokesman standing in front of cameras in Muscat instead of Tehran hardliners, threatening to burn the region down on state television. And there's one more angle worth thinking through before we wrap this up, which is what this entire episode teaches other regional actors watching from the sidelines. Every navy in the world capable of threatening a choke point just watched a live demonstration of exactly how the United States responds when one gets closed. Not with a single knockout blow, but with sustained economic pressure applied directly back at the source, paired with just enough destroyer and air power presence to make continued defiance too expensive to sustain. That's a template. It's the same basic logic that shaped decades of naval strategy around choke points from the Bosphorus to the Bab el-Mandeb. But this is the most complete real-time test case the world has seen in years. And it's happening with cameras, satellites, and social media documenting nearly every move in a way older naval standoffs simply never had. Whatever happens with this Oman framework in the next 90 days, the bigger lesson has already been written into the history books that trying to shut down global trade as a bargaining chip is a strategy that can win you headlines in the short term and cost you your entire economy in the long term. So what happens next is really the question worth asking. Does this Oman-brokered framework actually hold past its 3-month window, or does Iran try to quietly reassert tolls and control the moment global attention shifts somewhere else, the same way it did back in April? Does Washington accept a bilateral Iran-Oman arrangement, or does Rubio's dangerous precedent warning turn into an actual American veto that reopens the whole negotiation from scratch? And if this deal does collapse like the last one, is the blockade simply reimposed again, tighter and longer until Iran runs out of room to maneuver entirely? I want to know what you think happens from here. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear your read on this, especially if you think I'm wrong about where this is headed. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening in the Gulf instead of just seeing headlines fly by, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep covering stories like this in the depth they deserve. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because this Oman deal is far from the final word on Hormuz, and there's a very real chance we're back here in a matter of weeks talking about why it fell apart. Share this with somebody who's been asking what's actually going on with oil prices and the Middle East lately, because this is the story underneath that story. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.